Hi everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is intended to introduce the progressive movement. This video will not go into a lot of the specific laws and acts that were passed in the United States during the progressive era, but will instead focus on what the goals of the progressive movement were and the people that helped push those goals forward. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, let's look at who the progressives actually were. They have some similarities with the populists. They were in favor of more government regulation of business and railroads and increased safety in terms of labor and all of that. But the big difference between progressives and populists is that populists are an agrarian movement at this time around the turn of the century, and progressives tended to live in cities and suburbs and be a bit more educated. So one book I read one time said that progressives were populists that moved from the farm into the city. That's one way to think about that. But progressivism is a very big tent. It encompasses civil rights, organized labor. Religious leaders fall into that, and by that I mean people who were part of religion, but also, were trying to promote social reform. And all of those movements kind of fall under the umbrella of progressivism, and they're united by a philosophy called pragmatism, the root word there being pragmatic or practical. And what they thought, the pragmatists, was that society changes and policies should change as society changes. And they also thought that the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and the American dream and not getting any help from government like Horatio Alger did in the Rags to Riches novels was not realistic in an era where corporate greed ruled everything and government wasn't doing much to help in their eyes. So that government needed to do more to help the people. All of the progressive movements we're going to talk about in this video fall at least loosely under these four headings. If you want to go ahead and put these in your notes, if you're one of my students, all of the following slides will be organized as such. 1, protecting social welfare. 2, promoting moral improvement. It's a nebulous term. We'll talk more about what that means. 3rd, bringing about economic reform, regulation of business mostly. And number 4, fostering efficiency, making government and business work better for the people. The idea of protecting or promoting social welfare in the progressive era often centers around a movement known as the social gospel movement, which was religious organizations that would try to better the communities in which they were located. Some examples of that would be the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and of course the YWCA as well. Were founded with that in mind in the late 1800s. The Salvation Army came about as an organization trying to help the poor and unfortunate in their communities. And then settlement houses, which were organizations that would work to get immigrants and new arrivals to cities on their feet, find them a place to live, get them a job during this time. The most notable example of a settlement house is Hull House, which was founded in the 1880s by a woman named Jane Addams in Chicago, and she is a champion of the settlement house movement and helping the less fortunate in cities. Another notable person as part of this movement is Florence Kelley, who as a young woman, she was only in her 30s when she got her first big legislative victory, which was the first 8-hour workday in the United States, which Illinois passed in 1892. Her big movement, or her big goal, was to try to eliminate child labor, especially in factories where conditions were particularly dangerous. And she was able to encourage states to pass laws that would restrict hours worked by kids under 16, set minimum ages where kids could work at like 14, for example. And she also had a hand in civil rights. She was one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We're going to talk more about civil rights stuff later in this class if you're one of my students, but she had a big hand in that organization as well. The social gospel also would obviously suggest that they were focused on moral improvement or moral issues, and the big issue that gets the most attention during this time when it comes to moral improvement in society was prohibition, trying to limit the consumption or purchase or sale of alcohol. And you might recall, if you're one of my students, or even if you're a student of history in general, that temperance was a cause that came about during the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, and actually gained so much steam pre-Civil War that Maine banned alcohol in 1851, and several other states passed what were called Maine laws in the 1850s. But Maine repealed theirs several years later, and the Civil War sort of made the temperance movement a bit marginalized. But after the Civil War, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1873, and their goal was, as their name would suggest, trying to encourage states and local governments and even the national government eventually to ban alcohol. The most famous member of the WCTU was Carrie Nation. The spelling of her name is in dispute. It could be Carrie, which is how she usually spelled it. Her dad apparently spelled it Carry in the family Bible when she was born. Anyway, she was known for what were called hatchetations, where she would go into bars in the Midwest, especially in Missouri and Kansas, which is where she was from, and would destroy liquor bottles and the bar itself with her hatchet, and would be singing hymns while she did it. And she got arrested several dozen times and got a following over the years. And eventually she began calling herself Carrie A. Nation. Her middle name was like Amelia or something like that. But the idea was carry a nation morally, or carry a nation toward prohibition. Frances Willard was another leader of the WCTU. She was its president in the 1870s and 1880s, and encouraged them to focus on other issues too. Frances Willard was notable for raising the age of consent for women to have sex in many states, and promoting abstinence, I guess you could say. And she also focused on women's suffrage and women not being overworked in factories and things like that. Her slogan for the WCTU, despite its name focusing on temperance, was "Do everything." So focus on all of these different progressive issues. If you're wondering about the picture of the fountain there on the slide, that is located in Washington, D.C. They were in many large cities at the time. They're called temperance fountains that the WCTU and other similar organizations would put up in cities with clean drinking water. And the idea was that if you had clean drinking water at your disposal, maybe you wouldn't go into that bar and have an alcoholic beverage. When it came to business and the economy, progressives were big on pushing for increased regulation. And a lot of business regulations did get passed during the Progressive era, but not until later in that era, as we get closer to World War I, or after the turn of the century. But going back to the late 19th century, there were plenty of reforms that were being promoted and advocated for. Progressives also wanted to bring corruption in business and in government to the public's attention, and journalists were the ones who were a vehicle for getting that message out and exposing corruption and unsavory practices. And those journalists were called Muckrakers, named after a character in the Canterbury Tales, but someone who rakes muck, someone who digs up dirt, right? And so journalists would write magazine articles or books that would expose a seedy element of corporate life or the way government operated, and were able to get the public interested in trying to affect change. So here are just a few examples of muckraking journalists that worked during this time. If you're one of my students, Jacob Riis is someone you should be familiar with already, who wrote the book How the Other Half Lives, about horrible conditions in cities and led to some building codes and regulations being passed when it came to slum housing and tenements. Ida Tarbell is maybe the most notable muckraker when it came to exposing corruption in big business. She wrote a series of articles for McClure's magazine around the turn of the century about Standard Oil and the unsavory practices they had used to consolidate their holdings through horizontal and vertical integration, how they used this power to drive the price of oil up and ruin competitors and all of that. And she had actually used her investigative powers to get people at Standard Oil to open up the books for her, and so she could see, evidence of what they had been doing. And she might be, more than any other person, responsible for Standard Oil being broken up by the government in 1911 into a bunch of other smaller oil companies. Lincoln Steffens focused on government. His book, The Shame of the Cities, in 1904, looked into the workings of political machines. I don't think he investigated Tammany Hall. I could be wrong about that, but he focused on machines in places like Philadelphia and St. Louis because, as you might recall me saying in class before, just about every major city in America at this time had some kind of political machine that was at work within it. But it led to more regulations regarding government operations, especially in cities, and got the public to notice these corrupt practices that were going on when it came to party bosses. Finally, progressives sought to make society more efficient in general, and that applied to the workplace as well. This was the age of what was called scientific management, developed by that guy there, Frederick Taylor. It's sometimes called Taylorism, but it emphasized making factory work especially more efficient, picking the right person for the right job and producing as much as you could in as little time and for as little price as you possibly could. As a result, jobs became rather unpleasant. Instead of taking any kind of pride in your work, in many cases, you just sort of became a cog in a machine, right? And to oversee all of these cogs in the machine to make sure that things were working efficiently, that led to a lot of businesses and factories hiring a lot more managers. So during this time, the ratio of manager to worker tended to be a lot lower than it had been before as well. And, also made a lot of workers pretty unhappy just to have bosses breathing down their neck all the time. One byproduct, I guess, of scientific management and this focus on efficiency is the assembly line, which was first used extensively by Henry Ford at the Ford Motor Company to produce the Model T, which was the first car that was mass-produced and affordable for average, everyday people. And one of the big perks of working for Ford, since it was a pretty unpleasant job, is that you got paid $5 a day, which back then was an absurd sum of money. There were a lot of laborers, common laborers at the time, who did not make $5 a week. So $5 a day was a king's sum. And as a result, people were happy to work there, even though the job was not the most pleasant, just working at one thing on an assembly line for hours and hours and hours and hours at a time. But one of Ford's other ulterior motives was he wanted to pay his workers enough to where they could possibly buy a Model T and pump that money back into the factory as well. Progressives wanted to make government more efficient as well. And the idea behind a lot of political reforms when it came to progressivism was that the government would work better and be more responsive if there was more accountability. So you see a movement emerge to give people more of a say in the way that they voted and in the way they interacted with their government. So some examples of that, ways to increase voter participation or to make it less corrupt: the secret ballot, which eliminated or helped eliminate the influence of party bosses in politics and voting. Direct primaries, where people could vote for the nominee of the party instead of those nominees being picked by the Democratic boss and the Republican boss in a city. Direct election of U.S. senators. Until 1913, U.S. senators were chosen by state legislatures. The 17th Amendment, which was passed in 1913, changed that and made senators elected by whole states' populations, similar to the way congressmen are elected within their districts. And then at the local and state level, you've got something called initiative, recall, and referendum. These are not at the national level. So these are things that some states and some local governments have to give people more of a say in the government's operation. Initiative is when you can work to put something on the ballot. So if you think there should be, a law about local education or something like that, you can get a petition going around, and if enough people sign that petition, you can present it to the government, and they'll put it on the ballot to be voted on at the next election, for instance. So it's not just the city council or the county commission or whatever that's deciding what the laws are. You have a say in that as well. Referenda, or referendum is the singular of it, is when a government will decide to put something on the ballot. A lot of times this will be tax increases nowadays or bonds for education. Those things will be put on ballots to be voted on at election time. Those are called referendums. And then the recall is when you can remove an official from office who is corrupt or doing a bad job. So again, this is not at the national level, so you can't recall the president or a member of Congress, but some states will have a mechanism for removing a governor by vote, or taking a state legislator out of office before their term is up if they're doing a particularly bad job or if they become unpopular. Local governments also became more democratic during this time. Again, the decrease or marginalization of party bosses was a big goal of the progressives. Putting public utilities under city control, so instead of having private companies that controlled like the power and the water, the public controlled those things, which made them less corrupt and less susceptible to greedy businessmen who were out for profit, right? Also, more locally elected officials. Instead of bosses appointing everybody through the spoils system, you begin to see like city councilmen or commissioners, or even the mayor in some cases. Even today, sometimes the mayor is appointed, but in more places, the mayor became an elected official, which again made the government more responsive to the people. That's all we have today. If you're in my class going forward, we'll talk about some of the successes that progressives actually had and what some of their shortcomings were. Cheers.